Hello, and welcome to Aviation Deep Dive. When you hear the name Junkers, what images and stories does it conjure up? Is it the first east to west flight across the Atlantic? Do you remember the name as a pioneer in the early days of European airlines? Or an influence on the Bauhaus movement to create something practical, efficient, and beautiful in its simplicity? I guess that, for most, even those vaguely interested in aviation or even passing knowledge of history, the name Junkers conjures up images of the infamous and fearsome Ju-87 Stuka ground attack aircraft, its iconic Jericho trumpet striking fear and terror into the hearts of fleeing civilians and soldiers alike as it screamed down out of the skies. It seemed that even the Ju-52, or Ju, which started life as a peaceful civilian airliner, could not spare Junkers' name from its fate, for it found itself pressed into service as a bomber during the Spanish Civil War. It was then used again during the Blitzkrieg, delivering paratroopers, helping the Wehrmacht steamroll across Europe and Russia, and then making the last desperate flights out of Stalingrad when it all started to go wrong. Junkers aircraft could be found wherever the Luftwaffe flew and Wehrmacht boots marched. And yet, the founder of Junkers believed in the power of civilian aviation as a way to bring people together. He spent his time with an international group of designers, artists, and craftsmen who helped define the modern world. More importantly, he despised the National Socialists and everything they represented. He would have been horrified that his name is now linked with the war, aggression, and destruction, but it was his opinions and attitudes that cost him everything, including the company that bore his name, and arguably, his life. This is the story of Hugo Junkers, a forgotten aviation pioneer whose name deserves to be rescued from pages of history and remembered for very different reasons. When it came to aircraft design, Hugo Junkers was a very late bird to the party. His first work was on the Resna Ente, or Resna Duck in English, an unusual aircraft built in the canard configuration with its tailplane ahead of the wing and a 70 horsepower pusher engine at the back, which made the whole thing look as though it was flying backwards. Junkers met its creator, Jacob Resna, when they were both working as professors at the University of Aachen, and they became interested in his experiments with powered flight. Junkers' work was mainly in thermodynamics, but he had already become interested in airfoil design a few years before. Junkers had submitted a patent for a hollow wing made of metal, with all components not needed for flight tucked neatly away inside. Everything from control cables to fuel and structural support should be kept away from the flight surfaces to make them more efficient. The patent was submitted in 1909, the year his collaboration with Resna began, and the year Blériot flew the Channel, making these two Germans fear that their country was falling far behind the French. Germany had not even flown its first indigenously made aircraft, so this would have been a chance to restore some national pride. The Duck flew 3 years later, on August 7, 1912, with Junkers designed metal wings made at his own facility in Dessau. The aircraft might look like an Antoinette monoplane and a Fokker Eindecker had collided in the dark, but it also showed the one basic design characteristics that would be common to all of Hugo Junkers' aircraft. Every flat surface of the Duck was made out of rigid metal sheeting. Later in his career, this would be duralumin, but in 1912 it was sheet steel, sculpted into a rigid corrugated pattern. This gave the Duck, and all aircraft that followed it, great strength and solidity that other aircraft of the time lacked. His contemporaries roundly mocked Junkers, and everyone knew that aircraft had to be as light as possible, so they should ideally be made of canvas and wood. Junkers would soon prove his critics wrong, scoffing at those who thought iron doesn't fly. Junkers' involvement with the Duck was all the more surprising, given two things. Firstly, Junkers was 50 and was making his debut in aviation at an age when most university professors of mechanical engineering would have been content to teach and tinker with their own experiments. Secondly, he had already made his name and fortune designing engines, gas devices, and water heaters for the home. But Hugo Junkers was not a conventional man. Born in 1859, Junkers' birth predated that of modern Germany, which was only created by unifying a strange collection of disparate states and principalities in 1871. He was born in Reit, near Mönchengladbach, making him a Prussian, a region known for its dour, disciplined, and obsessively orderly citizens. This disconcertingly stoic mindset propelled him to university, where he studied engineering, but the early deaths of his parents meant that Junkers was not known for being carefree and fun to be around. On graduating, he briefly worked for his father's company before studying thermodynamics and electromagnetism. What seems to have changed is that he met Therese Bernhold while playing tennis and fell in love with her. She was 17 years younger than him, she was 22 and he was 39, and the parents opposed the match. Junkers was a man scraping by on money from a small engineering company and didn't seem like an especially brilliant candidate to be their daughter's future husband. Fortunately for Junkers, he became much more eligible by securing a professorship in Aachen, and the two were married. In time, they had 12 children. Junkers' small company also started becoming successful enough for Hugo to stop lecturing and focus on his engineering. He was already producing his patented engineering solutions, introducing an engine and a heater, and later specializing in making a gas-fired bathwater boiler. If this sounds unimpressive by modern standards, to Germans in the early 20th century, it seemed like the height of luxury, and by 1911, Junkers' factory had made over 100,000 of them. The water heaters might not have been very exciting, but they made it possible for everything that came next. With the First World War well underway, Junkers was soon doing very good business making gas appliances such as baths and field kitchens for the German army, as well as more lethal items like grenades and detonators. However, his experience with the Reisner Duck had given him a taste for aviation, and work was now started on the first purely Junkers aircraft, known in his company as the J-1. Junkers' civil engineering projects had been split between Dessau, about an hour and a half southwest of Berlin, and Aachen, on the Belgian border, where Junkers had his own wind tunnel. As the war continued, all staff were concentrated in Dessau from mid-1915 onwards, where Junkers had another wind tunnel, ideal for his experiments on wooden models of aerofoils. The testing confirmed his belief that thick, hollow wings were the way forward, and later the same year, 3 different sets of all-metal cantilever wings with a tubular steel structure started undergoing stress and loading testing. Designers Otto Mader and Otto Reuter started working on the J-1 under guidance from Hugo Junkers, and their work caught the eye of military inspectors, who were presumably visiting Dessau to check that stove production was on target. Whatever the reason, they were impressed by the innovative new design and ordered a trial model. Junkers might have expected access to supplies of a lightweight but strong alloy of aluminium and copper known as duralumin. If he did, he was destined to be very disappointed. The Germans' airship program had access to all available supplies, so Junkers had to make do with sheet steel, which was expecting a little too much of its modest Mercedes D2 6-cylinder engine. 15 workers built it in just 6 weeks, and the airframe was stress tested by hanging lines of sandbags from its wings. The finished version was sent to the Army test facility at Dobritz Airfield, arriving in December 1915, and at some point seems to have been given the nickname Blechkäse, or Tin Donkey, by pilots who didn't quite believe that it would get off the ground at all, let alone fly. Lieutenant Friedrich Mallinckrodt was the luckless individual who was chosen, and it turned out to everyone's surprise that the aircraft did indeed fly, if not particularly quickly, and yet did little in the way of gaining altitude. Mallinckrodt would later score 6 aerial victories in the First World War, but his greatest claim to fame is that 10 years later, he had an affair with Anthony Fokker's wife, Elisabeth von Mugen, a niece of Hermann Göring. She rapidly found herself divorced by an angry Fokker, but may have reflected on the fact that she had a better time of things than the second Mrs. Fokker, who died after mysteriously falling out of a hotel window. However, the War Ministry showed no signs that they were unimpressed with the J-1's performance, and ordered 6 more aircraft at 25,000 marks each, around $150,000 in today's money. Still, Junkers was busily working on a new improved version that would now be known as the Junkers J-2. Mallinckrodt resumed test flight duties, and while the aircraft proved to be maneuverable and relatively fast, its climbing performance was terrible. One of the requirements was for the aircraft to reach 3,000 feet in 20 minutes, a target it unfortunately failed to meet, leading officials from the War Ministry to walk away. "We had to start again from the very beginning," dejected Junkers later wrote. The reason was that in spite of the favorable horizontal speed, the aircraft could not meet the military climb specifications. We had to develop an aircraft that not only had low drag, but that could climb well, an aircraft with a low weight-to-power ratio. Junkers finally achieved this with his next aircraft thanks to the fiery end of numerous Zeppelins, which meant that because the giant airships were no longer viewed as the wonder weapon they once were, the factory could now access supplies of duralumin. This would be the perfect material for the Junkers J4. Intended as a ground attack aircraft, it was a sesquiplane, meaning its upper wing was larger than the lower wing. It also had 5 mm of armor, including the 2 crewmen in a very early attempt at doing something similar to the Sturmovik, or the A-10. This was a tacit recognition that flying low over infantry soldiers and the occasional anti-aircraft gun in something made of wood and doped canvas was likely to prove fatal to the crew and their airframe. An order for the J4 was placed on March 20, 1917, but not before an unwelcome new development that soured Junkers against collaborating with other companies appeared. The authorities thought Junkers, which had never produced aircraft at volume, should work with Anthony Fokker, one of its favored designers. This arrangement to Hugo Junkers, who had already spent around 1.5 million marks on research and development and had been repeatedly asking for more money, seemed like a win-win. The problem was that Fokker was as unscrupulous in business as he was inspired in aircraft design. His business partners and associates tended to find that their patents were infringed on a regular basis, and that Fokker himself was preoccupied with profit above all other things. Fokker offered Junkers 500,000 marks, around 3 million in today's money, to build the J4 under license and compensate him for using his patents. But Junkers, thinking he could get a better deal, demanded a 500,000 mark non-refundable deposit, plus a 10% unit charge per plane, with strict control over his patents. And to top it off, he also wanted each plane to carry a plaque bearing the words "Patent Junkers." The offer was not well received, and both men spent time feigning illnesses before meetings at which the deal was supposed to be sorted out. By April 1917, Fokkers now only wanted access to Junkers' patents for wing design, but Hugo Junkers once again said no. However, fed up with their squabbling, the authorities decreed that they work in a joint enterprise, and so on October 20th, 1917, the Junkers-Fokker Flugzeugwerke was set up in Dessau. The J4 was known to the army as J1, and to the people who flew and maintained them as Mobilwagens, or furniture carts, of which 220 were delivered between October 1917 and January 1919. So well built was this machine that numerous crews wrote to the factory to thank Junkers and his staff for making such a robust aircraft, which they credited for saving their lives. Reports are that only one was lost to a French anti-aircraft gun, but this is impossible to verify. Junkers' next idea was to revisit the J1 design, but this time they used lightweight duralumin rather than steel, which would give it vastly improved performance. Initially known as the J7, it would become the J9 during development. However, when it later ended service with the Imperial German Navy, it was again renamed as the DI, although what happened during its development depends on which source you choose to believe. The facts are that Fokker, himself an accomplished pilot, took the prototype for a spin in January 1918 and promptly crash-landed it. Some say the damage was minor and easily repaired, while others say he did it intentionally because he viewed it as a rival in the competition for a 10 million mark fighter contract. No matter what happened, Fokker's sharp business practices and constant vying for position had finally alienated the authorities to the point where Junkers was seen as the better bet. When the war ended, a wave of political unrest swept Germany. Fokker was lucky to escape from an angry workers' council at his Schwerin factory, which had radical left-wing revolutionary guards patrolling the premises. Ultimately, Fokker was paid off handsomely with around 1.5 million marks and left for good on April 14, 1919. Hugo Junkers, on the other hand, was faring the winds of change much better. He now had an aircraft factory and had all the related infrastructure, reasonable rewards after having to endure working with a notoriously slippery Anthony Fokker all those years. While his competitors were designing aircraft resembling lawn furniture, Junkers had made the first all-metal aircraft in the J-1 and the J-4 and the first all-metal aircraft in mass production. Now free of Fokker, Junkers could focus on transforming European aircraft design and showing what the future would look like. The war's end pointed away from military aircraft towards ones for the civil market. Junkers wasted no time introducing an aircraft that would revolutionize travel, the Junkers F-13, the world's first all-metal passenger aircraft. When the first international service was flown between Hounslow in London and Le Bourget in Paris on the 25th of August 1919, using a converted Airco DH-9 light bomber, the F-13 had already flown 2 months before. It offered a very different experience that was a testament to Junkers' vision. Around 9,000 hours were invested in the aircraft, and what emerged was unique. An all-metal aircraft with room for 4 passengers in an enclosed cabin and 2 crew in a partially open cockpit. The passengers had seatbelts, an unusual development at the time. The first aircraft, named Anneliese after one of Junkers' many daughters, flew on June 25, 1919. A second F-13 was completed a few weeks later and was fully flight certified, quickly setting a world height record, having taken 8 passengers to a height of 6,750 meters. This would be a huge export success, but the company was about to face 2 major issues. Firstly, Junkers had an endless ability to make terrible business decisions. Foreign representatives flocked to Dessau, including American businessman John Larsen, who had been born in Sweden and once acted as the European face of the Curtiss Airplane Company. Larsen asked if he could build the F-13 under license. Junkers said no. Could he buy 100 F-13s now and create an American factory to make 100 more? Junkers said yes. The problem was that Junkers then fell out with Larsen. Changes in the dollar's value and the mark meant that Junkers tried to increase the price and denied Larsen the right to change his design, perhaps fearing that he had just signed a deal with another Fokker. Some of the first F-13s in the US also crashed after the American fuel, which had a different composition to European fuel, ate through the fuel lines and generated very bad publicity. The company's second issue was the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles, signed by Germany in 1919. This treaty effectively placed responsibility for the war on Germany and included provisions to limit its military capabilities. Among these were Article 201, which banned the production of aircraft and aircraft parts in Germany, and Article 202, which ordered the surrender of all aviation-related products. There must have been relief at the Junkers factory, as the F-13 seemed exempt since it was not a military aircraft. Still, the Allies were out for revenge, and both Articles 201 and 202 were later interpreted to mean civilian aircraft as well. A move which would kill the F-13 and close any route to get it into markets, foreign or domestic. There was a strong element of victor's justice, as the French had described the F-13 as the craft of the future, and wanted to protect their own industry from the vastly more advanced Junkers design by quickly making sure it didn't fly, or if it flew, didn't sell. The Inter-Allied Control Commission offered an olive branch. Junkers could export 20 F-13 aircraft if he gave one free of charge to each of the 5 Allied nations. Junkers said no. With this refusal, the aircraft, already boxed up in crates and waiting to be shipped to Larsen, was seized in Hamburg. Some estimates suggest that this decision could have cost the company around 19 million marks. This meant that German manufacturers were banned from making anything that even looked like an aircraft, and that aircraft builders like Hugo Junkers could either go build other things and wait for times to change, or find somewhere else to go. Secret discussions were already taking place between the German military and the new Soviet government, who offered to let the Germans carry out military projects in their country in exchange for helping build up the Red Air Force. Junkers chose to believe one German official who promised that the government would underwrite the risks when, in reality, the German army officials had actually promised no such thing. When the subject came up again, there were vague mutterings about how he could pass on all costs to the Soviet government. Probably. Junkers' reluctance to turn this probably into a definitely meant that he was heading into a disaster that would make the arguments with Fokker look like a minor tiff. The Soviet plans centered on an automobile factory at Philly, outside Moscow, that had previously produced the giant Sikorsky Ilya Muromets aircraft during the war. And while Junkers received secret payments from the German army, the state and the conditions of the Philly plant meant that these payments must have done little to cushion him from the shock of how undeveloped and primitive the factory was. His relationships with the Soviets did also not bode well. They wished things achieved through paragraphs and legal compulsion rather than goodwill, Junkers told his diary. These actions cripple productive work. The Soviets used this compulsion to place more and more responsibility on Junkers to make the initiative work, and yet at the same time, the German army who had helped sponsor the project was not providing enough money to make a success of it. Junkers was now caught between two governments who were wholly indifferent to his welfare or that of his business. The project eventually came off the rails. The Manchester Guardian broke the story that Germany was rearming under the alarming headline, "Cargoes of Munitions from Russia to Germany," and talked of fiendish secret plans. A later story mentioned Junkers by name and blamed the German military, and when the German press picked up the story, there was chaos. There was also anger in Germany. It seemed that the army had gone rogue and was spending millions of marks on secret projects without the knowledge of the government or any elected politician. So in exchange for agreeing to pay back 1 million marks by December 31st, 1926, and giving 3.7 million marks of equipment to the state and 4 large aircraft, the government would write off all Junkers' debts. The factory in Philly continued producing Junkers aircraft until 1926, when the Soviets paid 6 million marks to acquire it from him. This factory eventually became the foundation of the Soviet aviation industry. Notably, Andrei Tupolev gained valuable experience there, and for 3 years, between 1923 and 26, the Soviets had access to German aircraft designers who were arguably among the best in the world. Junkers had hoped to use the Soviet partnership to expand his airline operations, but when the Philly factory closed, the Soviet branch of his airline collapsed, bringing the entire company to the brink of ruin. Junkers had started his airline in 1919 and called it simply Junkers Luftverkehr, roughly translated to Junkers Air Transport, or just Junkers Airways. Through a network of associated companies and the small but revolutionary genius of the F-13, which faced few competitors, Junkers quickly became involved in a vast web of routes that stretched from Lisbon to Istanbul and from Helsinki to Rome. It also helped that in 1922, controls on German aviation were partially relaxed, and around 94 examples of the F-13 were sold to German airlines, most of which were already associated with Junkers. It also helped that setting up an airline was relatively easy. Local companies and industries provided the funding, and Junkers sold them an F-13. These new airlines quickly became operational and were connected to others founded in the same way. In 1925 alone, 68 examples of the aircraft were built, all headed for the airline Europa Union, which was an intrinsic part of Junkers Luftverkehr. It would have been possible for the enterprising traveler with time on his hands to board an F-13 in the Finnish capital, stretch his legs in Berlin, board another F-13 bound for Munich, and then hop on an F-13 to take in the sights of downtown Budapest. The world and its airline bosses were impressed. So much so that in the end, a total of 322 of these aircraft were delivered to 30 countries and used by 70 airlines outside of Germany. In the process, the F-13 was modified with an increased wingspan and received a series of more powerful engines, making it even more capable of running lucrative air services for people who would pay a premium for the newest mode of transport. At this time, there were 2 blocks of airlines in Germany, one backed by Junkers and the other by a company called Deutsche Aero Lloyd. The 2 were locked in a fierce, highly uneconomical competition, each setting cheaper and cheaper fares, with the state subsidizing air travel effectively underwriting this unsustainable rivalry. Eventually, something had to give, and unfortunately, it was Junkers. The prolonged, slow collapse of his misadventures in the Soviet Union was made worse by the fact that the Soviets signed an airline deal with Deutsche Aero Lloyd instead of with Junkers. At the same time, the German economy was deteriorating, making airline subsidies a poor investment. By October 1925, the banks expected to pay Junkers to repay the 12 million marks they had lent to him to fund the Philly factory. However, he found himself unable to find the money, forcing the government to step in. The government, who were perhaps angry over the whole Philly disaster and wanted to disguise their part in it, forced Junkers Luftverkehr to merge with Deutsche Aero Lloyd to form Lufthansa. Hugo Junkers lost control of his airline and would ultimately lose control over his own company. However, the company, still under Hugo Junkers, was ready for a glorious burst of aircraft design. If the F-13 expanded the map, what followed next turned the map over and drew an odd aircraft on the back. It was the Junkers G-38, an aircraft that prefigured the Airbus A380. It was an early, bold attempt at a massive, large-capacity aircraft, something ahead of its time. At once, it was one of the most beautiful and innovative aircraft of the interwar era, but it also made no commercial sense whatsoever. Like the A380, the G-38 was a remarkable technical achievement, but was ultimately impractical and financially unviable. The G-38 started life as the JG-1, a giant four-engined passenger-carrying monoplane that was at least one-third wing. Design work started in 1920, and construction had already begun on the wing and the rear fuselage when Allied inspectors enforcing the Treaty of Versailles found it and told the Junkers to destroy it. There were also designs that were being roughed out for a 60-seat airliner called the Junkerszimmer, but these died with the JG-1. There was even work done on an unsettlingly unusual aircraft called the J-1000, which mainly consisted of a giant wing holding passengers and two huge sponsons holding even more. While it reached the stage of having mock-ups of the passenger cabins built at Dessau, it attracted zero commercial interest and went no further. However, all of this work was not wasted, as the J-38 was about to prove. In essence, the G-38 was the culmination of the Junkers' thick-wing design philosophy, since it now saw everything placed in the 6-foot thick wing. This meant that it housed all components, and not just the essential ones. It held the engines, allowing the crew to complete maintenance work during the flight, and some of the passengers sat in cabins that blended with the leading edge of the wing, giving them a view superior to that even of the pilot. Designed by Ernst Zindel, it first flew in early November 1929 after 2 years of development work, with test pilot Wilhelm Zimmermann at the controls. It became the largest land-based passenger aircraft in the world, with 4 diesel engines that would later propel it at a stately 140 miles an hour. However, the objective had not been to create a fast airliner, but to compete with the Zeppelin service, which was similarly not concerned with speed, but with luxury. Accordingly, the cabins were opulently furnished, and there were similarly beautiful smoking rooms and washrooms within the fuselage. What it lacked in speed, the G-38 made up for in lifting power, and it set speed, distance, and duration records for an aircraft with a 5,000-kilogram payload. In November 1930, it embarked on a round-Europe flight to drum up interest. But despite Junkers' hopes that the G-38 would be a commercial success similar to the F-13, only 2 were ever built. The first of the 2 aircraft was sold to Lufthansa in July 1931, and the second was built in 1932. The first iteration could carry just 11 people on the Berlin to London route, and although capacity later increased to 30, this was not the stuff of which commercial success was made. Even though the G-38 looked great on posters, being as it was an arrestingly beautiful design, it was, however, a commercial dead end. Neither aircraft survived. One plane crashed on takeoff in 1936, writing it off. The second one managed to soldier on until May 1941, until the RAF caught it on the ground in Athens during the invasion of Greece and bombed it flat. Junkers did have some export success with the G-38. Mitsubishi asked Junkers to develop it into a heavy bomber. A license agreement was signed with the company in April 1930, and a team headed by Herbert Schade, who had also worked on the disastrous Philly venture, now traveled to Japan to oversee the work. Parts for the first 2 prototypes were built in Dessau and shipped to Mitsubishi, which turned them into fully operational aircraft. Under the designation Ki-20, the first was flown by Wilhelm Zimmermann in Japan. The Japanese then built a further 4 themselves, designed to have a crew of 10 and a 5-ton bomb load. However, experiments with more powerful engines did nothing to improve the performance expected of a modern bomber. Junkers would have more success when he returned to the F-13 design with a slightly more orthodox mindset. The idea was to create a cargo-only version with a squad of fuselage cross-section, a cargo door, and a further door in the cabin roof. This resulted in the W-33, a type that had its first flight as an open cockpit floatplane version on June 17, 1926 at Leopoldshausen on the River Elbe, and a variation of it, the W-34, was flown a few weeks later on July 7th. This had a few slight differences, including a higher cabin and a different tail, and was available to customers with a much wider array of engines. However, both were significantly more successful as land planes. Changes in the ban on aircraft production in 1926 meant that the new aircraft would be built in Germany, but a militarized version, for which there was interest, would have to be built outside the country. To this end, AB Flygindustri at Limhamn in Sweden was chosen as a subcontractor, and around 18 were built there to be used in Finland, Portugal, and South America. While the militarized version was intended for use as a bomber or troop transport, around 21 examples were made as military ambulances or as military cargo aircraft, with some remaining in Sweden with the Swedish Army. Many versions finally had a completely enclosed cockpit, completing the journey away from its origins in the F-13. A number of these aircraft were also built in the Soviet Union, some using parts made in Dachau and others made at Philly and other locations. They were known within the Soviet Union as the PS-3 or PS-4, and many of them seem to have served in Siberia, but a lack of accurate record keeping makes it hard to determine what flew where. The fact that the aircraft was used in such harsh environments, however, is a testament to the quality of its design. The robustness of the W-33 meant that it was used in a series of attempts on various records, such as the record for continuous flight, with the W-33 staying aloft for 65 hours. It also flew over a distance of over 4,000 kilometers, which took 52 hours. None, however, was more dramatic than the Atlantic crossing. This was inspired by the distance and endurance records which were seen as proving flights, and although two aircraft, named the Bremen and the Europa, were being readied for the first ever east-west trip, bad weather prevented any attempts in 1927.
The two aircraft had been purchased by the press officer of the Norddeutsche Lloyd Shipping Company,
an aristocrat who rejoiced in the name Ehrenfried Gunther Freier von Hunefeld, and who also had support from Lufthansa's head of night flying, a man called Hermann Kohl, who had flown bombers during the First World War. Each was named after the SS Bremen and SS Europa, two elegant steamships which would enter service with von Hunefeld's employers in 1928. The authorities and the aviation press in Germany were becoming hostile to such risky record attempts, and airports were directed to keep their eyes out for any suspiciously heavy-looking aircraft. Even Kohl, despite having been a pilot on one of the endurance flights, was told that he wouldn't be released from duty. Kohl decided to attempt the flight anyway. He flew from Bremen to Tempelhof Airport in Berlin to Baldonum Aerodrome in Ireland, with von Hunefeld hiding in the cargo bay. Kohl told the authorities it was a proving flight to Dachau, managing to depart just before airport officials received an order to seize the aircraft. At Baldonel, the pair picked up their co-pilot and navigator, James Fitzmaurice, who had previously flown with the RAF despite being born in Dublin. With everyone on board, the trio headed out over the Atlantic just after 5 a.m. on April 12, 1928. Their target was Mitchell Field in Long Island, New York. At 6 the following morning, it became obvious that the compass they had been relying on was 40 degrees in error. A note passed between Kohl and von Hunefeld survives and speculates about whether they had enough fuel to stay in the air. Fortunately, they did. At around 6 in the afternoon, after 36 hours of flying, they landed in a peat bog on Greeley Island near Newfoundland. They might have been short of their destination, but the success of the flight made the Germans forget their disapproval and was impressive enough for the crew to be given a ticker tape parade in New York and the award of the Distinguished Flying Cross. Tragedy would overtake two of the crew over the next few years. Never the healthiest of men and already blind in one eye, von Hunefeld died in 1928, while Kohl retired to a farm he had bought to avoid the new masters of Germany and died in Munich in 1938. James Fitzmaurice passed away in Dublin on the 26th of September 1965. Their epic flight helped Junkers sell over 200 W-33 aircraft, which were widely exported and flown everywhere from Mongolia to Ethiopia. Perhaps the final noteworthy design of the brief post-financial crisis renaissance was the Ju-52, the company's most successful design, directly inspired by its designer Zindel's work on the W-33. Work started in 1928, and the aircraft was initially conceived as a single-engine cargo carrier, later designated Ju-52/1M for one motor, and strongly influenced by the company's earlier G-24 trimotor. The Treaty of Versailles mandated that the Germans could only use engines with a low power output, so the G-24 was designed so that the airlines could replace the three engines with a more powerful engine in the nose and simply delete the others. Now that the regulations had been relaxed, Zindel could design the Ju-52 from the start as an aircraft with a single powerful engine. Photographs show the aircraft, which even looks hopelessly underpowered relative to its size. Junkers only managed to sell one to an airline in Canada, although it had been thoroughly tested. Once again, Zimmermann made the first flight in September 1930. In December, it was flight certified by the civilian authorities before being presented to the public at Tempelhof a few months later in February 1931. A German cargo airline was loaned the aircraft for operational trials, but just as the seventh aircraft was being completed, Junkers decided to stop production and turn the Ju-52, like its older brother the G-24, into a trimotor. This time, it would be because Junkers chose this configuration, not because they had been forced to do so. Studies for the three-engine variant started in April 1931 when Hugo Junkers realized the cargo version wouldn't sell. Lufthansa also said that they would place an order provided the aircraft had three engines. 3 rather than 1 promised safety and reliability to prospective passengers, and, as if to validate this approach, Lloyd Aero Boliviano placed an order for 2 as soon as they knew it was being suggested. Lufthansa's first Ju-52 flew in May 1932, and they tested it first on a flight around the Alps against the Dornier Do-10 and the Fokker F-12, a test which it won handsomely, and then on the difficult Transalpine route from Munich to Milan and down to Rome. It passed this test too, which served as a green light for airlines around the world to place their own orders. A logical culmination of everything Junkers had worked on since the Reisner End, its success was remarkable, and over 400 were delivered by the time the Second World War broke out. By contrast, around 600 civilian Douglas DC-3 aircraft were built before production ended in 1943, placing it on a similar level. But as we now know, some very dark clouds were on the horizon. A global financial crisis unfolded in 1930 and deepened into 1931, causing many companies that owed money to Junkers to default on their debts. Junkers itself lacked the financial strength to ride out the crisis. The high development costs of aircraft like the W-33 and Ju-52 had drained the company's resources, leaving it effectively out of money. By March 7, 1932, Junkers was unable to pay its bills. Hugo Junkers appealed to the courts to find a settlement, and a review board was installed to look at the company's long-term financial viability. However, on March 22, 1932, all wages and salary payments were suspended, and the company entered insolvency proceedings. Junkers finally accepted punitive terms to keep the company going, including a greater degree of state control, and sold off the heating and plumbing division of the company to Bosch for 3 million marks. His former secretary, Adolf Detman, had to be given formal control of the companies, and worse yet, all debt had to be satisfied by 1933, which, as circumstances had it, was the year that the Austrian painter came to power. As the dictator took office on January 30, 1933, the state made it clear that it wanted the works at Dachau. Junkers was starting to receive anonymous, threatening letters, one even denouncing him as an old Democrat, which seems like a bizarre insult. It turns out that Adolf Detman had a communist past, which was all the justification his persecutors needed to denounce Junkers as a spy working against the German state. A prosecutor called Lammler was appointed, who was swiftly arresting various employees who were accused of establishing communist cells, and investigated Junkers and his children. There was talk of treason, and it was asked why Junkers had tried to start a factory in the Soviet Union. Was he a secret communist? As this pressure increased, Junkers stepped away from his companies, sold many of his shares, and signed away his patents, but the state wanted him out completely. He was arrested in Bavaria and transported back to Munich on October 7, 1933, and was bullied into stepping back entirely. The meeting ended at 2 a.m., and Junkers, aging and finally beaten down by the legal threats, gave in and was forcibly retired to his residence in Bavaria. The state now had possession of the Junkers company. However, it did not end there. On November 29th, Lammler sent the police to his residence and limited his ability to travel before arresting him again on February 2nd, 1934. Junkers could only stay in his residence in Bavaria. If he wanted to leave, he would have to be accompanied by a police officer. The house was under surveillance, his telephone was cut, and contact with former employees and even his son was forbidden. There was no hope of the authorities changing their stance, although Junkers continued to contest the decision, and it is not surprising that his health began to suffer. On February 3rd, 1935, on his 76th birthday, Junkers died of a heart attack. The Third Reich attempted to send a wreath, but the family told them that if they did, the funeral would be moved to a new location. That should be the end of the Junkers story, but another aspect of his time with his company at Dachau deserves attention, and produced at least one enduring symbol of Junkers' legacy. The same year that the F-13 first flew, a new art school was set up in Weimar under the leadership of Walter Gropius, an architect who had served on the Western Front during the First World War, winning the Iron Cross. Gropius's idea was to fuse a range of disciplines together, from architecture to art, with the idea that there should be a complete unity of any object's form and function. Twee details were cut, and simple clean lines with no fiddly decorations were in. The mayor of Dachau, Fritz Hess, asked Gropius to relocate to the city with support from various advocates already there, including Hugo Junkers, who was drawn to their approach to design and their more liberal politics. They were provided with land on the Buchunauer Alley and created an arrestingly modernist school building and several houses known as masters' houses for senior teaching staff. Each building had sweeping expanses of whitewashed concrete, steel and glass, partly made possible by Junkers' expertise with materials. He provided hot water systems that made their houses and school buildings into comfortable and livable spaces, and his expertise with steel helped designer Marcel Breuer to create his iconic minimalist B5 chair, which looks as though it could have come from the passenger cabin of a G-38. The main building was formally dedicated on December 4th, 1926, and Junkers, who had always made a habit of avoiding parties, crowds, and anything that looked like publicity, stayed on at the dedication party long after midnight. Junkers had plans for the gifted architects of the Bauhaus movement to design a new housing development for his workers that went beyond providing basic living space. It would have houses for single people, families in the old, a hospital, a swimming pool, a theater, a stadium, and other leisure facilities, all in a landscaped park. The plans were destined to go no further than blueprints. But it was Peter Drummer who would help Junkers leaving a lasting legacy, since it was he who designed Junkers' distinctive flying man logo, said to represent Icarus, the mythical Greek figure who flew too close to the sun, oddly accurate for Junkers' life. Drummer had also served in the First World War and created some alarming artworks that were inspired by his experiences. Afterwards, he created a series of highly political paintings inspired by revolution, and later went to work on corporate identity with Hugo Junkers in Dachau. It was here that he cooperated with numerous members of the Bauhaus movement, including Breuer, on his tubular steel furniture. The Flying Man logo was carried aboard all Junkers aircraft after 1925 when Drummer devised it, but this would not carry any weight with the authorities. The Nazis destroyed the Bauhaus movement, scattering its staff into exile. They also arrested Drummer in 1933 because of his political sympathies, driving him to a complete mental and physical breakdown, although he survived the war and died in 1968. For anyone interested in Junkers' legacy, there are surviving examples of the F-13 in France, Germany, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Sweden. One was built from scratch in Germany by a team financed by businessman Dieter Morzek, and it had its first flight in 2016. The original of the Bremen is now on display in a special hall at Bremen Airport, with a military W-30 floor on display in Colombia. Several examples of the J-52 have also survived. Many are in Germany, where the most famous example is the aircraft that bears the registration DAQUI and is undergoing slow and careful restoration at the Paderborn-Lippstadt Airport. There are 18 locations in Dessau that function as a Hugo Junkers trail, where people can see what remains of his legacy and just how his ingenuity helped the Bauhaus create a template for a beautiful, egalitarian future that never quite happened. Hugo Junkers' words before one of the Atlantic attempts seem as though they could stand as his epitaph. "We must utilize aircraft to bring peoples closer together. My highest goal is through productive struggle to bring both material and cultural prosperity to mankind. Instead of aircraft being instruments of war, we will make them weapons of freedom and of mankind." It might be unrealistic to imagine that Junkers' name will ever cease to be associated with combat aircraft in general and blitzkrieg in particular. Still, just once in a while, it could be worth getting the fog of war to clear and looking again at the man who once saw what the future could look like. A peaceful, hopeful future that shimmered in black and steel corrugated duralumin and crackled with 9-cylinder promise.